Hello, everyone. Welcome to Inspirational True Stories, where everyday tales are shared with all their emotional ups and downs. Have you ever paused amidst the hustle and bustle of life to reflect on the pieces you might have unintentionally overlooked? Today, I bring you a very special story, one about people who seem like strangers but are connected more deeply than we could imagine. A story of redemption, family love, and the journey to rediscover oneself. Let's dive into today's story. The streets of New York City pulsed with life, an orchestra of blaring car horns, hurried footsteps, and the ceaseless hum of ambition. Amidst the chaos, a sleek black sedan glided through the urban river, its driver shrouded in the glow of his dashboard. Jonathan Blake, a titan of finance, sat rigidly behind the wheel, his jaw set and his piercing blue eyes scanning his phone's glowing screen. Notifications about stock projections, acquisition bids, and profit margins flooded his inbox, each one a call to action he couldn't ignore. The city outside his window is a blur of neon and pedestrians, an abstract backdrop to his relentless focus. His hands tightened on the leather steering wheel as he glanced at the time. Another meeting loomed, a ruthless negotiation that would further cement his empire. To Jonathan, life was a series of calculated moves, a chessboard where emotions were liabilities and attachments, weaknesses. Yet, as his car rolled to a halt at an intersection, fate interjected. On the corner of 42nd and Lexington, a woman in a battered wheelchair sat beside a small stand of hand-tied bouquets. Her face was lined with the wear of hardship, but her eyes held a quiet dignity. Beside her stood two boys, their hands smudged with dirt, but their faces alive with determination. They moved with the urgency of children carrying burdens too heavy for their age, their small hands arranging flowers with meticulous care. Jonathan's gaze lingered on them longer than he intended. Something about the boys caught his attention, a tug in his chest, foreign and unwelcome. The older one, no more than 10, stepped forward, his unruly dark hair framed eyes that seemed to mirror the city's vibrancy. But it wasn't just their spirited glow that stopped Jonathan cold. It was their familiarity. The sharp jawline, the slightly upturned nose, these features that seemed to echo his own childhood photos now buried in an attic box he hadn't opened in years. The boy approached Jonathan's car, clutching a bouquet of wildflowers wrapped in simple brown paper. His small frame stood firm, undeterred by the imposing figure in the luxury car. "Sir, would you like a bouquet?" the boy asked, his voice clear and steady despite the din of the city. Jonathan rolled down his window, his expression unreadable. He glanced at the bouquet, then at the boy, his mind spinning for a reason to dismiss this fleeting moment of curiosity. But the boy's eyes, those unnervingly familiar eyes, held his attention. "How much?" Jonathan asked, his tone more abrupt than he intended. $5, sir." "It's to help our mom," the boy replied, his voice tinged with both pride and a quiet plea. For a moment, the chaos of Jonathan's world paused. He reached into his wallet and pulled out a crisp $20 bill. Handing it to the boy, he said, "Keep the change." The boy's eyes widened in surprise, his gratitude shining through a cautious smile. "Thank you, sir." As Jonathan prepared to roll up his window, he glanced once more at the woman in the wheelchair. She was watching the exchange with a quiet intensity, her hands resting on her lap. There was something in her gaze, an unspoken connection, or perhaps a question, though Jonathan couldn't quite place it. The moment passed quickly, and the light turned green. Jonathan drove on, the bouquet resting on the passenger seat like a silent witness. His mind, usually a fortress of logic and strategy, wrestled with the encounter. The boys' faces lingered in his thoughts, a reflection he couldn't shake. Who were they, and why did they feel like a part of a past he had long buried? The city swallowed him once more, but the memory of that brief exchange refused to fade. For the first time in years, Jonathan felt something stir within him, a faint crack in the armor he had so carefully constructed. And though he didn't yet realize it, the crossroads he had just encountered was more than just a traffic stop. It was the beginning of a journey that would challenge everything he thought he knew about himself and the life he had built. The city's rhythm usually matched Jonathan's own, unforgiving, relentless, and meticulously ordered. Yet, as the car weaved through the labyrinth of Manhattan, something within him unraveled. The bouquet of wildflowers sat beside him, a silent anomaly in the sleek, sterile interior of his car. It was as though the flowers, vibrant and unruly, were out of place in his controlled world of sharp edges and calculated outcomes. They whispered to him, their fragile petals a symbol of a life he had long since abandoned, a life of vulnerability, of connections untethered to profit margins. Jonathan's hands gripped the wheel tighter as his mind circled back to the boy, that boy's eyes. He could see them now, even with his gaze fixed on the road ahead, as though they had imprinted themselves on his memory like an unresolved equation demanding his attention. They weren't just familiar, they were haunting, like an echo of a voice he couldn't quite recall, but knew had once spoken to him. His phone buzzed, jolting him back to the present. Another email, another demand for his time, his energy, his soul. He glanced at it briefly. It was from the CFO of a company he was set to acquire. The numbers danced across the screen, impersonal and hollow, yet they carried the weight of millions of dollars. Normally, the sight of such figures would anchor him, remind him of his purpose. But now they felt trivial, like sand slipping through his fingers. The memory of the boy's words surfaced. It's to help our mom. The simplicity of it gnawed at him. He couldn't shake the thought of the woman in the wheelchair. Who was she? What had brought her to that corner, in that condition, with two boys who bore such an uncanny resemblance to himself? The questions clawed at him, each one a seed of doubt cracking through the concrete of his meticulously crafted persona. He pulled into the underground parking garage of his office building, the familiar scent of oil and metal enveloping him. As he stepped out, the bouquet remained on the passenger seat, mocking him with its presence. He hesitated. His instinct was to leave it behind, to let it wither like so many other moments of weakness he had ignored. But something compelled him to take it. The flowers felt heavy in his hand, as though they carried the weight of an untold story. The elevator ride to his office felt interminable. The polished steel walls reflected his image back at him, a distorted version of the man he thought he was. His tailored suit, his perfectly knotted tie, they suddenly seemed like armor, shielding him from the truth he wasn't ready to face. The bouquet, cradled awkwardly in his hand, was the only thing that felt real in that mirrored prison. As he stepped into his corner office, the panoramic view of the city stretched before him like a kingdom he ruled but could never touch. He set the bouquet on his desk, its vibrant colors a stark contrast to the sterile monochrome of his workspace. For a moment, he simply stared at it, as though the flowers might offer answers to the questions swirling in his mind. But the questions didn't subside. Instead, they multiplied, each one more intrusive than the last. Why had he stopped? Why had he given the boy $20 without a second thought? And why did those boys feel like ghosts from a past he had long buried? Jonathan sank into his chair, his head in his hands. Memories, unbidden and unwanted, began to surface. A small house in Queens, a mother who worked too hard and smiled too little, a father who was there but absent in every way that mattered, and a boy, himself, but younger, freer, selling newspapers on street corners, not unlike the boy with the flowers. He had left that boy behind years ago, or so he thought. But now, sitting in his high-rise office, surrounded by symbols of his success, Jonathan felt the faint stirrings of regret. He had traded the messy, imperfect beauty of life for the sterile certainty of power and wealth, and yet in that brief moment at the intersection, the past had reached out to him, not as a reprimand, but as a reminder. The bouquet seemed to radiate something, as though the flowers themselves were alive, whispering stories he had tried to forget. Each petal, delicate and ephemeral, felt like a fragment of his own neglected humanity. They were a symbol of fragility, of impermanence, qualities Jonathan had always considered weaknesses, but now they seemed like truths he could no longer ignore. The knock on his office door was sharp, pulling him from his reverie. It was his assistant, Rachel, a woman whose efficiency he admired and whose personal life he knew nothing about. "Sir, the board meeting is in 10 minutes, she said, her tone professional but tinged with the faintest hint of concern. Her eyes flicked to the bouquet on his desk, but lingered for only a moment. "I'll be there," Jonathan replied, his voice steadier than he felt. As Rachel closed the door, Jonathan looked back at the flowers. The board meeting awaited, a stage where he excelled, where every word he spoke carried weight and influence. But for the first time, it felt like a performance. The thought unsettled him. He stood, straightened his tie, and picked up the bouquet. On impulse, he carried it with him as he left his office. The elevator ride down felt different this time. The mirrored walls no longer reflected a man in control, but one unraveling, piece by piece. Jonathan stepped out onto the bustling street, the bouquet in his hand like a compass pointing him somewhere he couldn't yet name. The questions still lingered, and the answers remained elusive. But as he walked, blending into the rhythm of the city, he felt the faintest glimmer of something he hadn't felt in years, a sense of possibility. And with every step, the flowers seemed to grow heavier, as if reminding him that this journey, whatever it was, would not be easy, but it would be worth it. The bouquet sat on Jonathan's desk like a silent witness to the storm raging within him. Its vibrant petals seemed to mock the grayscale world he had constructed for himself, a world devoid of softness or sentimentality. It was just a bundle of flowers, yet it had become a symbol, one he couldn't ignore. The memory of the boy's face and the quiet dignity of the woman in the wheelchair clung to his thoughts like ivy wrapping around the ruins of an old cathedral, persistent and unyielding. For years, Jonathan had been a master of decisions. Every move, every deal was calculated with precision, weighed against risks and rewards. His empire was built on logic, on the cold, hard certainty of numbers. But now, standing in the quiet of his office, the bouquet seemed to ask a question that no spreadsheet could answer. What have you forgotten? The air in the room felt heavier, thick with unspoken truths. The skyline outside, once a testament to his triumph, now seemed distant and hollow, as if the towering buildings themselves were turning their backs on him. He ran a hand through his hair, the motion both a habit and a plea for clarity. But clarity didn't come. Instead, his mind replayed the scene at the intersection, the boy's voice, and the way those eyes, his eyes, had stared back at him. Jonathan grabbed the bouquet, its stems cool and damp in his hand, and strode out of his office. His assistant Rachel glanced up, startled as he passed her desk. "Sir, is everything okay?" she asked, her voice laced with concern. "I'll be out for the afternoon," Jonathan replied without breaking stride. He didn't wait for her response. The questions inside him had grown too loud, demanding answers he couldn't find in the sterile confines of his office. The streets of New York greeted him with their usual cacophony, but this time, the noise felt different. The city seemed alive in a way it hadn't before, its chaos no longer an annoyance, but a reminder of life's unpredictable beauty. The bouquet in his hand felt heavier with each step, as though it carried the weight of the decision he was about to make. He hailed a cab, his voice firm yet uncertain as he gave the driver the address of the intersection. It wasn't far, but the ride felt like an eternity. The world outside the window blurred, the colors and shapes smearing together like an abstract painting. Jonathan's thoughts churned, memories surfacing, unbidden. He remembered his mother's hands, calloused from years of cleaning houses, yet gentle when they tucked him into bed. He remembered the smell of her perfume, cheap and floral, but comforting. And he remembered the way she used to look at him, her eyes full of dreams she'd never realized but hoped he might. The cab came to a stop, jerking Jonathan back to the present. He paid the driver and stepped out onto the sidewalk. The intersection was just as he remembered, bustling with life, its corners crowded with vendors and pedestrians. But the flower stand was gone. The space where the woman and her boys had been was now empty, as if they had vanished into thin air. Disappointment settled over him like a cold fog. He stood there, bouquet in hand, feeling unmoored. For a moment he considered turning back, retreating to the safety of his office and the predictable rhythm of his life. But something, an ache, a pull, kept him rooted to the spot. He noticed an older man sitting on a nearby bench, his face weathered and kind. The man was feeding pigeons, scattering breadcrumbs with deliberate care. Jonathan approached him, the bouquet still clutched in his hand. "Excuse me," Jonathan began, his voice hesitant. "There was a woman here earlier, in a wheelchair, selling flowers. Do you know where she went?" The man looked up, his eyes thoughtful. "Ah, Maria. She's usually here in the mornings. By noon she moves on to another spot, tries to cover as much ground as she can." Jonathan nodded, the information both a relief and a frustration. He glanced down at the bouquet, its colors seeming to dim in the midday light. "Do you know where I might find her?" The man shrugged. "She's a bit of a wanderer, but if you're looking for her, she might be at the park near 8th Avenue. She likes the quieter spots." Thank you," Jonathan said, slipping a folded bill into the man's hand. The man nodded, his weathered face breaking into a small smile. Jonathan walked toward the park, the bouquet now feeling like both a compass and an anchor. The questions in his mind grew louder with each step. "Why do you care?" they seemed to ask. "What are you hoping to find?" He didn't have answers, but the act of searching felt significant. It was as though the cracks in his carefully constructed life had let in a light he hadn't realized he was missing. And with that light came something else. Hope, fragile and tentative, but real. The park was quieter than the streets, its paths shaded by towering oaks and lined with benches. Jonathan scanned the area, his eyes searching for the woman and her boys. He felt a pang of doubt. Perhaps this was foolish, a waste of time. But then he spotted them. The woman sat under a tree, her wheelchair parked beside her. The two boys were playing nearby, their laughter ringing out like music. Jonathan stood frozen, the bouquet trembling in his hand. For a moment, he considered walking away, but something in the woman's posture, upright and proud despite her frailty, drew him in. He approached slowly, his footsteps crunching on the gravel. The younger boy noticed him first, his eyes lighting up with recognition. "Sir, you came back!" the boy exclaimed, running up to him. The older boy followed, his expression more reserved but equally curious. The woman looked up, her gaze meeting Jonathan's. Her eyes were calm, but there was a flicker of something else. Recognition, perhaps, or understanding? Jonathan extended the bouquet toward her. I thought these might belong with you." The woman took the flowers, her hands trembling slightly, her lips curved into a gentle smile. "Thank you," she said, her voice soft but steady. Jonathan sat down on the grass beside her, the boys hovering nearby. He didn't know what he was going to say, but for the first time in years, words didn't feel like weapons or shields, they felt like bridges. And as he began to speak, sharing pieces of himself he hadn't touched in years, he realized that this moment, this choice, wasn't about answers. It was about connection, about remembering who he was and who he could still become. Jonathan sat on the park bench, the laughter of the boys echoing around him like a melody from another time. He watched them chase each other across the grass, their movements unburdened by the weight of the world. Yet, beneath their youthful exuberance, he noticed the signs of a life tempered by struggle. The careful way they watched their mother, the quick glances they exchanged as if silently ensuring they were both okay. It struck a chord deep within him, one he wasn't sure he wanted to hear. A woman, Hannah Sullivan, as she introduced herself, was a study in resilience. Her hands, delicate but strong, clutched the bouquet he had brought. Her face bore the subtle lines of a life lived under pressure, but her eyes remained steady, like the calm at the center of a storm. She thanked him again for the flowers, her voice soft yet carrying the weight of unspoken gratitude. For a moment, Jonathan hesitated, unsure of how to bridge the gap between them. He felt as though he were standing on the edge of a cliff, peering into the unknown. Then he asked carefully, "Do you mind if I ask about your boys?" Hannah glanced toward Liam and Noah, her expression softening. "They're my world," she said simply, but there was a tremor in her voice that hinted at the immense sacrifices behind those words. If you enjoyed today's story, or if it touched your heart in any way, don't forget to like. "They remind me of someone I used to know," Jonathan said, his tone measured, though the words carried far more weight than he let on. Hannah's gaze turned back to him, sharp but not unkind. She seemed to assess him, as though trying to determine whether his curiosity was genuine or superficial. "I don't usually talk about my personal life," she began, then paused. Her grip on the bouquet tightened. "But sometimes it helps." Jonathan nodded, the gesture encouraging yet unobtrusive. He could feel the tension in her words, like a string stretched taut, ready to snap. "I wasn't always here," she started, her voice carrying a note of bitterness, though it was tempered by acceptance. I used to be an economist. I worked for one of the top firms in the city. Numbers, data, they were my language." She gave a small, rueful laugh. Funny how life can strip you of everything you thought you knew. She was more than usually self-conscious about height. "What happened?" Jonathan asked, his voice quieter now, almost hesitant. "A car accident," Hannah said, her words clipped but heavy with meaning. "It wasn't even my fault. Wrong place, wrong time. My legs—" She gestured down at her wheelchair, her hands trembling ever so slightly. "They told me I'd never walk again. I lost my job, my savings drained into medical bills, and the father of my boys decided he didn't sign up for this kind of life." Her jaw tightened, and Jonathan caught the flicker of pain in her expression before she smoothed it away. "And the boys?" Jonathan's eyes drifted back to Liam and Noah. "They were just babies," Hannah said, her voice softening again. "Twins, born a little early. They've been through more than most kids their age should ever have to endure. But they're strong." Her lips curved into a small smile, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Stronger than me, most days." Jonathan's heart clenched at her words, each one carving a deeper groove into the wall he had built around himself. He studied Liam and Noah more closely now, the way their dark hair caught the sunlight, the faint dimple in Liam's cheek when he smiled. It was like looking into a mirror reflecting a younger version of himself. The realization hit him like a freight train, unstoppable and inescapable. His mind raced to make sense of it, to piece together fragments of memories and timelines. Could it be possible? The resemblance was too stark to ignore, and Hannah's story. Jonathan cleared his throat, trying to mask the tremor in his voice. "Hannah, I don't mean to pry, but their father, do you know where he is?" Her face darkened, her expression hardening like stone. "No," she said flatly, "and I don't care to. He walked out on us the day he found out I couldn't stand on my own 2 feet anymore." Her voice was laced with anger, but beneath it lay a deep well of hurt. "We're better off without him." Jonathan felt his breath catch, his chest tightening, as if the weight of her words were pressing down on him. The image of the man she described was both foreign and familiar, a shadow of someone he could have been, if he had chosen differently. He hesitated, his thoughts a whirlwind. Should he tell her? Could he? The truth clawed at him, desperate to be acknowledged, but fear held him back. Fear of her reaction, of what it might mean for her and for him. Instead, he asked quietly, "Do they know anything about him?" Hannah shook her head, her lips pressing into a thin line. "I've never told them. Why burden them with a story that only brings pain?" She sighed, her gaze drifting toward the boys. "They deserve better." Jonathan swallowed hard, his throat dry. The boys' laughter rang out again, but this time it felt different, tinged with an innocence he wasn't sure he deserved touch. He wanted to speak, to ask the questions that burned in his chest, but the words caught in his throat. Hannah turned to him, her expression softening. "Why are you so interested?" she asked, her tone curious but cautious. Jonathan hesitated. The truth hovered on the tip of his tongue, a fragile thing trembling under the weight of its own significance. "They remind me of myself," he said finally, his voice low, "and of what I've lost." Hannah studied him for a long moment, her eyes searching his face for answers he wasn't yet ready to give. Then, as if sensing the depth of his turmoil, she simply nodded. The boys ran back to them, their cheeks flushed and their eyes bright. "Mom, can we get ice cream?" Liam asked, his voice filled with hope. Hannah smiled, the kind of smile that spoke of sacrifices too great to count. "Maybe tomorrow," she said, her tone gentle but firm. Jonathan felt a pang of regret, a deep ache that settled in his chest. He reached into his pocket, pulling out his wallet. "Here," he said, handing Liam a crisp $20 bill. "Get ice cream today. On me." Liam's face lit up, but he hesitated, glancing at his mother for approval. Hannah nodded reluctantly, her expression a mixture of gratitude and suspicion. As the boys dashed off to a nearby vendor, Jonathan turned back to Hannah. "Thank you for sharing your story," he said quietly. I hope you don't mind if I come back sometime." Hannah tilted her head, her eyes narrowing slightly, as though trying to decipher his motives, but then her expression softened and she nodded. "You're welcome too," she said, her voice carrying the faintest trace of trust. Jonathan watched as the boys laughed over their ice cream, their joy radiant and uncontainable. A part of him wanted to walk away, to leave the truth buried where it couldn't hurt anyone. But another part, a part he hadn't felt in years, knew that this was only the beginning. The truth would not stay silent for long, and when it finally came to light, it would change everything. The door to Edward Blake's office loomed large and unwelcoming, like the threshold to a battlefield Jonathan knew too well. He hesitated before knocking, his knuckles hovering over the polished oak surface. The familiar ache of unresolved tension settled in his chest. Conversations with Edward rarely ended well, and this one promised to be no exception. Still, the weight of the truth he carried left him no choice. When Edward's voice called out, sharp and impatient, "Come in!" Jonathan pushed the door open, steeling himself. The office was a monument to Edward's ambition. Dark leather furniture, imposing bookshelves filled with titles on business strategy, and a large desk that practically swallowed the room. Edward himself sat behind it, his sharp features and neatly combed hair a mirror of their father's intimidating presence. His eyes narrowed at Jonathan's unexpected arrival. "Jonathan," Edward said, setting aside a stack of papers with exaggerated precision. "What brings you here unannounced? Another acquisition on the horizon?" Jonathan ignored the jab and stepped inside, closing the door softly behind him. "I need to talk to you," he said, his voice unusually subdued. Edward raised an eyebrow, leaning back in his chair. "This sounds serious. What is it, another crisis you need me to fix?" Jonathan clenched his fists, but forced himself to remain calm. "It's not business, Edward. It's personal." Edward's expression shifted to one of mild irritation, as though Jonathan's words were an unwelcome distraction from more pressing matters. "Personal? Since when do you bring personal matters to me?" Jonathan took a deep breath, choosing his words carefully. There's a woman I met recently. Her name is Hannah Sullivan. She has 2 boys, twins, 6 years old." Edward's brow furrowed slightly, but he said nothing, waiting for Jonathan to continue. "They look like me, Edward," Jonathan said, his voice firmer now. "Same eyes, same jawline. I can't ignore it. There's a very real possibility they're my children." For a moment, silence hung in the room like a storm cloud about to break. Then Edward laughed. A sharp, bitter sound that cut through the tension like a blade. "Children? You think you might have children with some random woman selling flowers on a street corner?" Edward's tone was mocking, his disbelief palpable. "Jonathan, do you even hear yourself?" Jonathan's jaw tightened. "She's not some random woman. She was an economist, Edward. Her life fell apart after an accident. She's been raising those boys alone, doing everything she can to survive." "And you think it's your responsibility to swoop in and play hero?" Edward's voice dripped with scorn. "What happens when the tabloids find out? When the board catches wind of this? You've built a reputation, Jonathan, a legacy. You really want to risk it all for some sob story?" "This isn't about the business," Jonathan snapped, his voice rising. "This is about them. If they're my sons, I have a responsibility to..." "To what? Throw your life away?" Edward interrupted, leaning forward, his eyes blazing with anger. "Do you even understand what this could mean? For you, for the company, for the family?" Jonathan took a step closer to the desk, his voice low but filled with conviction. This isn't about you, Edward, or the family. It's about doing what's right." Edward slammed his hands down on the desk, the sharp sound reverberating through the room. "It's always about you, Jonathan," he shouted. "You've had everything handed to you. Dad's approval, the company's resources, the family's respect, and now you want to play the noble father, the savior, as if that makes you better than the rest of us." Jonathan stared at his brother, stunned by the raw bitterness in his words. "Edward, this isn't a competition. This is about 2 boys who might be my children." "It's always been a competition," Edward shot back, his voice shaking with emotion. "I've spent my entire life fighting for scraps of recognition, for even a fraction of the attention Dad gave you. And now you're telling me you're going to jeopardize everything because you feel guilty?" Jonathan felt his chest tighten, a mix of anger and regret swirling inside him. "This isn't guilt, Edward. It's responsibility. It's about facing the consequences of my actions." Edward scoffed, leaning back in his chair with a derisive smirk. "And what if they're not yours, Jonathan? What if this is just some desperate woman trying to pin her problems on someone with money?" Jonathan's fists clenched at his sides. "I've seen them, Edward. I've looked into their eyes, and I can't ignore what I see." Edward stood, his posture rigid, his face a mask of controlled fury. "Then you're a fool," he said coldly, "because this will ruin you, and by extension, it will ruin everything I've built." Jonathan's eyes narrowed, his voice dropping to a dangerous calm. "You didn't build anything, Edward. We inherited it. And maybe that's the problem. Maybe we've both been so focused on preserving Dad's legacy that we forgot to create lives of our own." Edward's expression flickered, just for a moment, before the anger returned. "Don't lecture me about life, Jonathan. You've always had the freedom to make mistakes, to chase whatever whim struck you. I've had to be the responsible one, the one who held everything together." Jonathan stepped back, his heart heavy with the weight of their shared history. "I didn't come here to fight, Edward. I came here because I thought you might understand, but clearly I was wrong." Edward's face hardened, his voice icy. "Stay away from this, Jonathan. For your sake, and for theirs." Jonathan shook his head, a bitter smile tugging at his lips. "You know, Edward, for all your talk about family, you seem to have forgotten what it actually means." Without waiting for a response, Jonathan turned and walked out of the office. The door closed behind him with a finality that felt like the end of something long overdue. As he stepped into the elevator, the adrenaline began to wear off, leaving him drained and uncertain. Edward's words echoed in his mind, each one a dagger of doubt, but beneath the doubt was something stronger, a resolve that had taken root the moment he saw Liam and Noah for the first time. The elevator doors opened and Jonathan stepped into the bustling lobby, the noise and movement grounding him. He took a deep breath, his mind clearer now. Edward might be content to live in the shadow of their father's legacy, but Jonathan knew he couldn't. Not anymore. This wasn't just about the boys. It was about breaking free from the chains of expectation, about reclaiming a piece of himself he had long buried, and as he walked out into the city, the weight of his decision felt lighter, as though the truth had finally set him free. The apartment door creaked open, and Hannah's face emerged, her expression a fortress of suspicion and bitterness. Jonathan stood in the dimly lit hallway, bouquet in hand, unsure of how to bridge the chasm between them. The air between them was thick, charged with a mix of unresolved history and present tension. "I shouldn't have come unannounced," Jonathan said softly, his voice almost lost in the silence. Hannah crossed her arms, leaning against the doorframe. Her gaze was cold, piercing through him with unspoken accusations. "No, you shouldn't have," she said bluntly. "But here you are." Jonathan held out the bouquet, its vibrant colors feeling inadequate against the weight of her stare. "These are for you. And the boys." Hannah eyed the flowers, but didn't move to take them. Instead, she stepped aside, letting him into the small apartment. It was modest, every piece of furniture a testament to survival rather than comfort. Toys were scattered across the living room, and the faint aroma of something simmering on the stove filled the air. The warmth of the home contrasted starkly with Hannah's icy demeanor. "Liam and Noah are out with a neighbor," she said curtly, closing the door behind him. "So if you're here to dazzle them with your charm, you'll have to wait." Jonathan set the bouquet on the table, his movements deliberate, as though trying not to disturb the fragile atmosphere. "I came to talk to you," he said, turning to face her. "I owe you that much." "You owe me a hell of a lot more than that." Hannah snapped, her voice cutting through the air like a whip. She moved to the opposite side of the room, putting as much distance between them as possible. "You've been living in luxury, Jonathan, while I've been selling flowers on street corners to keep our children fed. Where were you when I needed you? Where were you when they needed you?" Jonathan flinched at her words, the truth of them hitting like a punch to the gut. "I didn't know, Hannah. If I had known—" "You didn't, did you?" she interrupted, her voice rising, her eyes burned with anger. But there was pain there too, raw and unhealed. "You didn't know because you didn't care to look. And now, after all these years, you show up like some savior, expecting what? Gratitude? Forgiveness?" "That's not what I'm asking for," Jonathan said, his voice breaking slightly. I want to make things right." Hannah laughed, bitter and hollow. "Make things right?" she echoed, shaking her head. "You can't just waltz into our lives and undo years of struggle with good intentions, Jonathan. It doesn't work like that." He took a hesitant step toward her, his hands open in a gesture of surrender. "I know I can't change the past, but I want to be here, now, for you, for them." Hannah's expression faltered for a moment, the vulnerability beneath her anger surfacing like a crack in a dam. But she quickly recovered, her walls snapping back into place. "Do you even know what that means?" she asked, her voice quieter now but no less sharp. "Being here isn't about showing up when it's convenient for you. It's about staying. It's about being someone they can count on. Can you do that, Jonathan, or are you just here to ease your own guilt?" Jonathan didn't have an answer. The weight of her questions settled heavily on his shoulders, and for the first time, he realized just how much he had to prove, not just to Hannah, but to himself. "I don't expect you to trust me," he said finally, his voice low, "but I'm asking for a chance to earn it." Hannah stared at him, her eyes searching his face for any sign of sincerity. For a moment, the tension between them seemed to soften, but then she turned away, her back to him. "The boys deserve a father," she said quietly, almost to herself. "But I can't let them get hurt. Not by you. Not by anyone." Her words hung in the air like a verdict, and Jonathan knew he couldn't argue. He nodded, though she couldn't see it, and after a long, heavy silence, he left. When the door closed behind Jonathan, the apartment fell into an oppressive silence. Hannah sank onto the couch, her hands trembling as she picked up the bouquet he had left behind. The flowers were beautiful, bright and full of life, but they felt out of place in her world. She stared at them for a long moment before setting them down on the coffee table. Her mind churned, memories and emotions swirling like a storm she couldn't escape. Jonathan's face, his words, the raw regret in his eyes. It was all too much. She leaned back, closing her eyes, trying to steady her breathing, but the thoughts came anyway, relentless and unbidden. "Where were you, Jonathan?" She thought of the nights she had spent awake, cradling 2 crying infants, her body aching and her spirit breaking. She thought of the endless days on the street corners, her wheelchair a prison and a lifeline all at once. She thought of every time she had looked into Liam and Noah's eyes and promised them it would get better, even when she didn't believe it herself. And now Jonathan was here, offering apologies and promises that felt too little, too late. The boys deserve a father. The thought pierced her like a dagger. She couldn't deny the longing in their faces whenever they saw other children with their dads. She had done her best to fill the void, but she wasn't blind to what was missing. And yet, the idea of letting Jonathan into their lives terrified her. Can I trust him to stay? The question echoed in her mind, a relentless drum beat. Jonathan's history spoke of ambition, of a life built on calculated risks and rewards. What place did a struggling mother and 2 boys have in a world like his? And what would happen to Liam and Noah if he decided they weren't worth the effort? Hannah opened her eyes, staring at the bouquet on the table. The flowers seemed to mock her indecision, their vibrant petals a stark contrast to the gray uncertainty clouding her thoughts. She reached out and touched one of the blooms, its softness a painful reminder of how fragile everything felt. She wanted to believe him. She wanted to believe that he could be the father her boys needed, the partner she had once dreamed of. But the scars he had left ran too deep, and the fear of reopening those wounds kept her guarded. As the apartment grew darker with the setting sun, Hannah sat in silence, her thoughts a cacophony of hope and doubt. For her boys, she would endure anything. But letting Jonathan in, truly in, felt like a gamble she wasn't sure she could afford to take. And yet, as much as she hated to admit it, part of her wanted to. Jonathan stood in Vivian's penthouse, the skyline of New York glittering behind her like an indifferent witness to the storm brewing within him. The air was heavy with tension, silence stretching between them like a taut wire ready to snap. Vivian leaned against the marble counter, her posture casual, but her eyes betrayed a flicker of unease. She knew why he was here. He could see it in the way her fingers fidgeted with the rim of her wineglass. Vivian. Jonathan's voice broke the silence, low and trembling with restrained fury. Why did you do this? Vivian's gaze darted to him, her carefully constructed poise faltering for a moment. Do what, Jonathan? She asked, her tone feigning innocence but wavering at the edges. Don't, he snapped, his voice rising. He took a step closer, holding up the printed emails he'd uncovered. These, Hannah's emails. You intercepted them. You pretended to be me. And you, his voice caught, the weight of the revelation choking him. You sent her away. Vivian's face froze, the mask of indifference cracking as her carefully curated world began to crumble. She opened her mouth to deny it, but no words came. Instead, she turned away, setting the wineglass down with a sharp clink. Her silence was damning. Answer me, Jonathan's voice thundered, reverberating off the pristine walls. Why did you do it, Vivian? She turned back to him, her eyes flashing with a mixture of defiance and desperation. Because I had to, Jonathan, she said, her voice tight. I couldn't let her ruin everything we had. You were my world, my everything. Jonathan's laugh was hollow, bitter. Your world? You destroyed lives, Vivian. You destroyed her life, her children's lives, my children's lives. Vivian flinched at the venom in his voice, but quickly recovered, her own anger flaring. I destroyed them, she shot back. I protected us, Jonathan. She was just some woman you barely knew, some fleeting mistake. Mistake? Jonathan's voice was a low growl, his fists clenching at his sides. Hannah wasn't a mistake, Vivian. She was real. What we had, what we could have had, was real. And you stole that from me. I stole it? Vivian's voice cracked, her composure unraveling. I was the one who stood by you, Jonathan. Through every deal, every late night, every moment you needed someone to believe in you. And then she showed up, pregnant no less, ready to tear it all apart. Jonathan stared at her, his anger mingling with disbelief. She wasn't tearing anything apart. She was trying to reach me, to tell me about my sons. And you would have thrown everything away for her, Vivian spat, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. For someone you barely knew, for a life that didn't include me. Jonathan took a step back, his anger giving way to a deep, gut-wrenching pain. You didn't trust me, he said quietly, his voice thick with emotion. You didn't even give me a choice. You decided for me, and because of you, I've lost years with my children, with Hannah, Vivian's expression softened, her anger dissipating into something fragile and broken. "I loved you, Jonathan," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I still do. Everything I did because I couldn't lose you." Jonathan shook his head, his eyes filled with a mixture of pity and sorrow. "That's not love, Vivian. Love doesn't destroy. It doesn't manipulate. What you did, it wasn't about us. It was about control." Her shoulders sagged, the weight of his words crushing her. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The only sound was the faint hum of the city outside, a reminder of the world that continued turning despite their shattered truths. "I thought I was protecting us," Vivian said finally, her voice trembling. "I thought if I could just keep her away, we could..." "We could what?" Jonathan interrupted, his voice rising again. "Build a life on lies? Pretend none of this ever happened?" "You didn't protect us, Vivian. You destroyed everything." Tears spilled down her cheeks, her carefully guarded facade now completely gone. "I didn't know what else to do," she whispered. I was afraid." Jonathan's anger simmered, but beneath it was an ache that felt like it might consume him. "Fear doesn't excuse what you've done," he said, his tone colder now. "You stole something from me, from Hannah, from those boys. You took away a life we'll never get back." Vivian collapsed into a nearby chair, her head in her hands. Jonathan watched her for a moment, his emotions swirling in a storm of fury, betrayal, and regret. He wanted to yell, to lash out, to make her feel the depth of the pain she had caused. But more than that, he wanted to leave, to turn his back on the broken remnants of their relationship and focus on what truly mattered. Without another word, he turned and walked toward the door. As he reached for the handle, Vivian's voice stopped him. "Jonathan, wait." Her tone was desperate, pleading. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean to hurt you." He paused, his hand hovering over the doorknob. "Sorry doesn't change what you did," he said quietly, his back still to her. "And it doesn't fix the damage you've caused." With that, he opened the door and stepped into the hallway, the weight of the confrontation pressing heavily on his shoulders. The truth had been uncovered, but it felt like a hollow victory. There were no winners here, only broken pieces of lives that had been irrevocably altered. The cold night air hit Jonathan as he exited the building, its sharpness cutting through the fog of his thoughts. He stood on the sidewalk, the city buzzing around him, unaware of the turmoil within. For a moment, he simply stood there, letting the noise and movement ground him. His mind replayed the confrontation with Vivian, her desperate justifications ringing hollow in his ears. He had trusted her once, believed in the love they shared. But now, all he felt was anger. Anger at her betrayal, at the years lost, at the lives irreparably changed because of her selfishness. But beneath the anger was something stronger, resolve. He couldn't change the past, couldn't undo what Vivian had done. But he could take control of what came next. He could fight for his sons, for Hannah, for the family he had unknowingly abandoned. As he hailed a cab, Jonathan felt a flicker of hope amidst the turmoil. The road ahead wouldn't be easy. There were wounds to heal, trust to rebuild, but he was determined to face it. For the first time in years, he had a purpose beyond the boardroom, a mission that went beyond profit margins and business deals. And this time, he wouldn't let anyone stand in his way. Jonathan stormed into Edward's office, the doors slamming shut behind him with a force that rattled the glass panels. Edward looked up from his desk, startled but quickly masking his surprise with his usual composed arrogance. "Jonathan," Edward said smoothly, leaning back in his chair, "to what do I owe this dramatic entrance?" Jonathan didn't bother with pleasantries. He threw a stack of printed messages onto Edward's desk, the papers scattering like fallen leaves. "Explain this," he demanded, his voice cold and unwavering. Edward's gaze flickered to the papers, and for the briefest moment there was a crack in his carefully curated demeanor. He picked up one of the pages, his brow furrowing as he read the damning words. "Stay away from Jonathan. This is your final warning." Edward's face hardened, and he set the paper down with calculated precision. "Where did you get these?" "That's not the question you should be asking," Jonathan said, his voice trembling with restrained fury. "The question is why you sent them." Edward sighed, leaning back in his chair and steepling his fingers. "Jonathan, you don't understand the situation." "Don't you dare," Jonathan interrupted, his voice rising. "Don't you dare tell me I don't understand. I know exactly what this is. You threatened Hannah, you sabotaged her life, and you did it because of your pathetic obsession with control." Edward stood, his calm veneer cracking under Jonathan's accusations. "I was protecting what's mine," he snapped, his voice sharp and defensive. "If those boys are recognized, if Hannah is brought into the picture, do you have any idea what that means for the family, for the company, for me?" Jonathan's eyes narrowed, his anger simmering just beneath the surface. "This was never about the family or the company," he said, his voice low and cutting. "This was about you, about your greed, your insecurity, your desperate need to cling to something that was never truly at risk." Edward's lips pressed into a thin line, but his silence was confirmation enough. Jonathan took a step closer, his voice gaining momentum. "You've always seen me as competition, haven't you? Even when we were kids, it was never about being brothers. It was about who could win Dad's approval. And now, you've taken that same twisted mindset and turned it into this betrayal." Edward's jaw tightened, his hands gripping the edge of the desk. "You think I wanted this, Minasco?" he hissed. "Do you think I enjoyed watching Dad hand everything to you while I was left to fight for scraps? I had to make my own way, Jonathan. I had to claw my way to the top while you were always the golden boy." Jonathan's anger flared, but beneath it was a deep, aching sadness. "You always misunderstood, Edward. Dad didn't hand me anything. I had to work for his approval, just like you. The difference is, I never let it consume me the way you have." Edward scoffed, his expression twisting with bitterness. "Don't act like you're above this. You've had everything handed to you, opportunities, trust, power, and now you expect me to just sit back while you drag some woman and her kids into our lives? Do you have any idea what that will cost us?" "What it will cost you, you mean?" Jonathan said, his voice cutting like a blade. "Because this was never about the family or the company. This was about your greed, your fear." Edward's eyes flashed with anger, but there was something else there too, something closer to desperation. "If those boys are recognized as your heirs, where does that leave me?" he asked, his voice quieter now but no less charged. "What happens to my place in all of this, to everything I've worked for?" Jonathan stared at him, the weight of Edward's words settling heavily in the air between them. "You were never at risk of losing anything, Edward," he said quietly, "until you chose greed over family." Edward's face crumpled, his anger giving way to something raw and vulnerable. "You don't understand," he said, his voice trembling. "I've spent my whole life trying to prove I'm enough. To Dad, to you, to myself. And now I'm supposed to just step aside?" Jonathan's chest ached with the weight of their shared history. The years of unspoken resentment and rivalry finally laid bare. "This was never about stepping aside," he said, his tone softer now but still firm. "It's about doing what's right. About being the kind of men Dad wanted us to be. The kind of men our family deserves." Edward turned away, his shoulders slumping under the weight of Jonathan's words. For a moment, neither of them spoke, the silence thick with tension and unspoken truths. Finally, Edward turned back to face Jonathan, his expression a mixture of defiance and defeat. "You've already made up your mind, haven't you?" he asked, his voice tinged with bitterness. "You're going to bring them into this no matter what it costs." Jonathan met his brother's gaze, his resolve unshaken. "This isn't about cost, Edward. It's about family. Something you've clearly forgotten." Edward's jaw tightened, but he didn't respond. Jonathan took a step back, the tension between them palpable. "I'm not going to let you stop me," he said firmly. "Not this time." Without waiting for a response, Jonathan turned and walked out of the office, his footsteps echoing down the corridor like the final punctuation on their confrontation. The trembling in pains of his body began to turn into physical pains, and as the pain began to cease, it was almost impossible to see a separation between the events. Left alone in his office, Edward sank into his chair, his hands trembling as he picked up the messages Jonathan had thrown onto his desk. The words stared back at him, sharp and damning, a reminder of the lengths he had gone to protect what he thought was his. He set the papers down and stared out the window, the city sprawling beneath him like a kingdom he had fought so hard to claim. But now, the view felt hollow, the walls of his office suffocating. The truth was out, and with it came the realization that he might lose everything, not because of Jonathan, but because of his own actions. Edward leaned back, closing his eyes, as regret washed over him. He had spent his entire life chasing approval, chasing power, only to find himself more lost than ever. And now, the one person he had always seen as his rival had become something else entirely, a reminder of the family he had betrayed. For the first time in years, Edward felt truly alone. The morning sun filtered through the thin curtains of Hannah's modest apartment, casting a soft glow over the room. Jonathan stood in the park nearby, a soccer ball at his feet and two eager boys bounding toward him. Liam and Noah had been hesitant at first, their small hands clutching their mothers as they sized him up, but now their curiosity had started to outweigh their caution. Jonathan rolled the ball toward Noah, who stopped it with an awkward but determined kick. "Nice one, Noah," Jonathan called, his tone encouraging. Liam hovered near the sidelines, his arms crossed, his expression guarded. "Come on, Liam," Jonathan said gently, gesturing for him to join. "We could use your help over here." Liam hesitated, his eyes darting to Noah, who was already laughing as he tried to dribble the ball past Jonathan. Slowly, Liam uncrossed his arms and stepped forward, his movements tentative. Jonathan handed him the ball and stepped back, giving him space. "Show me what you've got," Jonathan said, his voice light but sincere. Liam hesitated for a moment, then kicked the ball, sending it rolling past Jonathan with surprising precision. A small, almost involuntary smile flickered across his face. "Wow, that's some skill," Jonathan said, clapping his hands. "You've got a great aim." Noah ran to retrieve the ball, his cheeks flushed with excitement. "He's the best at soccer," he said proudly. "Way better than me." "That's not true," Liam mumbled, but there was a softness in his tone that hinted at a bond forming. As they played, their laughter filled the park, drawing a small crowd of onlookers. Hannah sat on a bench nearby, her hands folded tightly in her lap. She watched as Jonathan knelt to tie Noah's shoelace, his movements gentle and patient, and her heart tightened. It was a sight she hadn't expected to see. A man who had once been a ghost in their lives, now standing in the center of their boys' world, making them laugh, drawing them out of their shells. "They laugh with him," she thought, her chest constricting. I haven't seen them laugh like this in years. But the sight wasn't without its complications. As much as her heart softened, her mind resisted. Can he keep his promises? The question loomed large, a shadow over every moment of light. Unbeknownst to Hannah, Jonathan had taken quiet steps to alleviate the burden she carried. He had hired a lawyer to pay off her medical debts, ensuring the funds couldn't be traced back to him. The crippling weight of those bills, which had loomed over her every decision, was now gone. He'd also begun funneling money into the community center where Hannah volunteered, providing new equipment for the children and covering the cost of overdue repairs. The staff whispered about the mystery donor, their gratitude overflowing, but Jonathan remained silent. This wasn't about recognition, it was about redemption. Every small act of kindness was his way of making amends, brick by brick, for the foundation he had failed to provide. And though Hannah remained unaware of the full extent of his efforts, she couldn't ignore the changes rippling through her life. As the weeks passed, Jonathan's presence became a regular part of their routine. He would meet the boys at the park, his business suits swapped for casual clothes and his phone tucked away. He wasn't just a visitor anymore. He was becoming part of their world. One afternoon, as they sat on the grass catching their breath after a game, Noah looked up at Jonathan with wide, curious eyes. "You're cool," he said simply, a statement that carried the weight of a child's growing trust. Jonathan smiled, the words warming something deep inside him. "Thanks, buddy." Liam, however, wasn't as easily convinced. He studied Jonathan, his expression thoughtful. "Are you going to leave again?" he asked, his voice quiet but direct. The question hit Jonathan like a punch to the gut. He glanced at Hannah, who had stiffened on the bench, her eyes wary. Turning back to Liam, Jonathan took a deep breath. "No, Liam," he said, his voice steady. "I'm here to stay. I promise." Yeah, Liam's gaze lingered on him as if weighing the sincerity of his words. Finally, he gave a small nod, though the caution in his eyes remained. It wasn't full acceptance, but it was a step forward. That evening, as Hannah prepared dinner, she found herself replaying the day's events in her mind. She could still hear the boys' laughter, could still see the way they had gravitated toward Jonathan despite their initial hesitation. It was as if he had unlocked a part of them she hadn't been able to reach. But the memories came with a bitter aftertaste. She couldn't forget the years of struggle, the nights spent worrying about how to provide for her sons. She couldn't ignore the deep scars left by Jonathan's absence. Scars that weren't so easily healed by soccer games and promises. Standing at the counter, chopping vegetables with mechanical precision, her mind churned with conflicting emotions. He says he's here to stay, she thought. But what if he leaves again? What if this is just another illusion, another chapter in a story that always ends the same way? She set the knife down, pressing her hands against the counter as tears threatened to spill. She didn't want to feel this way, to be caught between hope and fear, between trust and doubt. But as much as she tried to harden her heart, she couldn't deny what she had seen that afternoon. They need him, she realized, the thought cutting through her defenses like a blade. They deserve to have a father. The admission sent a pang of guilt through her. She had spent so long shielding Liam and Noah from disappointment, from pain, that she hadn't stopped to consider what they might gain by letting Jonathan in. But her own fears held her back, an anchor she couldn't seem to break free from. That night, as she tucked the boys into bed, Noah whispered, "Mom, do you think he'll come tomorrow?" Hannah hesitated, her heart aching at the vulnerability in his voice. "I think he will," she said softly, brushing a strand of hair from his face. Noah smiled, his eyes heavy with sleep. "Ha, I hope so." As she left their room, Hannah leaned against the doorframe, her arms wrapped around herself. The walls she had built so carefully were beginning to crack, and she wasn't sure if she had the strength to rebuild them. But for the sake of her boys, she knew she had to try, to find a way to trust again, even if it meant risking everything. The hum of the corporate boardroom seemed a world away from the cheerful chaos of the soccer field. Jonathan stood on the sidelines, his tie loosened and sleeves rolled up, clapping as Liam sprinted across the field, his determination shining through every step. Noah sat next to him on the bench, swinging his legs and chattering about his own game last week. It was a balance Jonathan hadn't thought himself capable of, juggling the high-stakes demands of his company while showing up for the moments that mattered to his sons. But as the weeks turned into months, he found himself prioritizing those moments, carving out space in his meticulously planned life for something unexpected and deeply fulfilling. Family. "Dad," Liam called from the field, waving after scoring a goal. The word struck Jonathan like a bolt of lightning. It was the first time Liam had used it, and it carried with it a mixture of pride, surprise, and a touch of disbelief. He raised a hand in acknowledgement, his smile broad and genuine, though his chest felt tight with emotion. Dad. The title fit like a long-lost piece of himself, one he hadn't realized was missing. Noah grinned beside him. "Liam never calls anyone Dad. You must be special." Jonathan chuckled, ruffling Noah's hair. "I guess I'm lucky, huh?" Family dinners had become a new tradition, a small ritual that felt like glue binding them together. Jonathan would arrive with fresh groceries, much to Hannah's chagrin, as she'd always insisted on providing for her own, but he'd learned to navigate her stubborn independence with patience and tact. Tonight, the aroma of spaghetti wafted through the small kitchen. Hannah stirred the pot while Jonathan helped Noah set the table. Liam was in the living room practicing his speech for school, his voice carrying faintly into the cozy apartment. "You're late," Hannah said as Jonathan set down a bottle of wine. "Board meeting ran long," he admitted, rolling up his sleeves. "But I'm here now." Hannah glanced at him, her eyes softening despite herself. "Good." The exchange was simple, almost mundane, but it carried a quiet significance. They were finding their rhythm, a delicate dance of give and take that neither had mastered, but both were learning. As they sat down to eat, the boys dove into their plates with gusto, recounting their day with animated gestures and laughter. Jonathan listened intently, chiming in with questions and encouragement, his attention fully on them. Hannah watched him, a mixture of gratitude and hesitation swirling within her. He was present in a way she hadn't expected, making time for the little things that mattered most. But a part of her still wondered, how long will this last? The peaceful cadence of their new life was disrupted one evening when Hannah received an unexpected visitor. Edward stood at her doorstep, his suit immaculate, but his expression tense. She hesitated before opening the door fully, the boys playing in the background, oblivious to the confrontation brewing. "What are you doing here?" she asked, her tone sharp. "I need to speak with Jonathan," Edward said, his voice clipped. "Is he here?" "No," Hannah replied, folding her arms. "And even if he were, I wouldn't let you near him." Edward's eyes flicked past her, taking in the modest apartment, the toys scattered on the floor, the faint laughter of the boys. "So, this is what he's giving everything up for?" he sneered. "You and—" "Don't you dare," Hannah interrupted, her voice low and dangerous. "You have no right to come here and judge us." Edward straightened, his expression hardening. "I'm protecting what's left of our family, Hannah. Jonathan's making a mistake, and you're letting him." "I'm letting him be a father," she said, her voice firm. "Something he should have been allowed to do years ago." Edward's mouth tightened, his frustration palpable. "You don't understand the damage he's doing to our company, to everything we've built." "I don't care about your company," Hannah snapped. I care about my boys, and I care about Jonathan, so if you're here to cause trouble, you can leave." The sound of a car door closing drew their attention. Jonathan approached, his eyes narrowing as he took in the scene. "What's going on?" he asked, stepping protectively toward Hannah. Edward turned to face him, his posture rigid. "We need to talk." "No, we don't," Jonathan said flatly. "You've done enough damage." Edward's jaw tightened, but he didn't argue. Instead, he turned on his heel and left without another word, leaving an air of tension in his wake. Jonathan turned to Hannah, his expression apologetic. "I'm sorry about that." "It's not your fault," she said softly, though the encounter had left her shaken. "But it's clear he's not going to let this go." Jonathan nodded, his resolve hardening. Let him try. Later that night, after the boys were asleep, Jonathan and Hannah sat together in the living room. The warmth of the day's events lingered, but so did the shadow of Edward's visit. "Do you think he'll come back?" Hannah asked, her voice tinged with worry. "Might," Jonathan admitted. But it doesn't matter. I'm not letting him or anyone take this away from us." Hannah studied him, her gaze searching. "You really mean that, don't you?" Jonathan turned to her, his eyes earnest. "I do. I've made mistakes, Hannah, more than I can count. But this, being here, with you and the boys, it's the only thing that feels right. And I'm not walking away." Her barriers cracked a little more, the weight of his words sinking in. "They've started calling you Dad, you know," she said quietly. Jonathan smiled, a hint of emotion flickering in his eyes. "I noticed." Hannah hesitated, her next words hesitant but heartfelt. "They trust you, and I'm starting to—" Jonathan reached for her hand, his touch gentle but firm. "I'll keep earning it," he said, "for as long as it takes." Hannah didn't pull away. For the first time in years, she allowed herself to hope, not just for her boys, but for herself. And as they sat together in the quiet of the apartment, the foundation of their new family grew a little stronger. The road ahead would be fraught with challenges, but they were no longer facing it alone. Together, they were finding their way, one small step at a time. The park stretched out like a vibrant canvas, painted with the colors of autumn. Leaves tinged with hues of gold and crimson floated lazily on the crisp breeze. Children's laughter mingled with the rustle of trees, and the sky above seemed impossibly blue, an endless expanse that invited dreams to take flight. Jonathan stood in the middle of an open field, holding the spool of a kite string in his hands. Liam and Noah danced around him, their voices bubbling with excitement as they directed him on how to launch the kite. In their hands was a simple yet brightly colored kite, its tail adorned with fluttering ribbons that caught the sunlight like small, playful flames. "Run faster, Jonathan!" Noah yelled, his face glowing with exhilaration. I'm running, Jonathan called back, his laugh escaping before he could stop it. His polished, composed exterior, once as tightly bound as the suits he wore, had loosened over the past months. Now, he sprinted across the grass like a man discovering joy for the first time, the kite soaring higher and higher with each step. "Let me try!" Liam shouted, running up beside him. Jonathan passed the spool to Liam, crouching to guide his hands. "Hold it steady, but don't let it get too loose," he instructed. Liam's small fingers gripped the spool tightly, his eyes locked on the kite as it danced against the sky. From a nearby bench, Hannah watched, her arms wrapped around herself against the gentle chill. Her gaze lingered on Jonathan, who had thrown himself wholeheartedly into this simple moment with the boys. She could see the transformation in him, not just in the way he moved or smiled, but in the depth of his presence. He was no longer a man divided between two worlds. He had chosen this one, fully and without reservation. "They're happy," she murmured to herself, her voice soft but carrying the weight of an epiphany. Jonathan glanced back at her, catching her watching them. He waved her over, a playful grin on his face. "Come on, Hannah, you can't just sit there. You have to see this up close." Hannah hesitated, her old instincts urging her to stay on the sidelines, to observe from a safe distance. But then she saw the boys, their faces lit with pure, unfiltered joy. Slowly, she rose and walked toward them, her steps tentative but deliberate. As she reached the group, Liam handed her the spool. "Your turn, Mom," he said, his voice tinged with a rare infectious excitement. Hannah shook her head. "I haven't flown a kite since I was a kid." "That's why you should try," Jonathan said, his voice warm and inviting. "It's easier than it looks, trust me." Something in his tone, gentle, unwavering, nudged her forward. She took the spool, her fingers brushing against his, and let out a small laugh as the kite dipped and then steadied in the wind. For a moment, she felt like the child she once was, unburdened and free, tethered only to the joy of the moment. As the boys ran off to chase a squirrel darting between the trees, Hannah and Jonathan found themselves standing side by side, the kite still soaring above them. The silence between them wasn't awkward. It was full of unspoken understanding, a shared acknowledgement of how far they had come. "You've changed, Jonathan," Hannah said finally, her voice thoughtful. "Maybe we all have." Jonathan turned to her, his eyes reflecting the sincerity of her words. "I had to," he admitted. "For the boys, for you, but mostly for myself." Hannah looked at him, her barriers lowering in a way they hadn't before. "I can see that. You're different now. More present, more real. It's a good change." Jonathan's gaze softened and he stepped a little closer. "I'll never let you or the boys carry this alone again," he said, his voice quiet but resolute. "I mean that, Hannah." The weight of his words settled over her. Not as a burden, but as a promise, a foundation upon which something new could be built. She nodded, her lips curving into a small, tentative smile. "I hope so." The kite dipped suddenly, caught in a rogue gust of wind, but Liam dashed forward, his quick hands catching the spool before it could hit the ground. "Got it!" he shouted triumphantly, his laughter ringing out across the field. Jonathan chuckled, ruffling Liam's hair as he retrieved the spool. "Nice save, buddy." As the kite rose again, its tail fluttering wildly, Hannah couldn't help but see it as a symbol of their journey. Like the kite, their family had weathered turbulence, moments of near relationship and uncertainty. Yet, with effort and care, they had managed to keep it aloft. Watching it now, soaring higher than ever, she felt a flicker of hope that it might stay there. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting the park in a warm, golden light, the family gathered their things. Liam and Noah skipped ahead, their voices filled with chatter about their next kite-flying adventure. Jonathan and Hannah trailed behind, their steps slow and measured. "Thank you," Hannah said quietly, glancing at him. "For everything. For not giving up." Jonathan smiled, his eyes fixed on the boys ahead. "It wasn't just for them, Hannah. It was for all of us. For a future we can build together." Hannah's heart swelled at his words, her guarded optimism blossoming into something more. She reached out, her hand brushing against his, and for the first time, she let herself believe that maybe, just maybe, this could work. As they reached the edge of the park, the kite still trailing in Liam's hands, Hannah looked back at the open field, the laughter of her son still echoing in her ears. It wasn't perfect, and there were still challenges to face, but in this moment, she felt something she hadn't felt in a long time. Peace. And with that peace came the realization that they weren't just mending what had been broken. They were creating something entirely new. A family, imperfect but whole, ready to face whatever came next. Above them, the kite soared into the fading light, a symbol of their resilience and hope, carried by the wind toward a brighter tomorrow. We are so glad you listened to the whole story today, and if you find it interesting, please comment number 2. If it is not interesting, please press number 1 so we can fix the content to be better and better. See you in the next story.